Greetings, comrades, and bienvenidos, compañeros, to this week's episode of Red Library, political education podcast for today's left. We are finally picking back up on our revolutionary politics in Central and South America series. And to do so, we're going to begin with the first of a two-part episode on the Guatemalan Revolution, the tragic rise and fall of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. Our primary source material for analyzing this really important historical moment, this lost future of communist development in Central America, is going to be the excellent work by historian Piero Gleijeses called Shattered Hope, the Guatemalan Revolution in the United States, 1944 to 1954. This one is kind of getting back to our roots, as we're going to talk a little bit about at the beginning of the episode, but it's basically me and the OG, CC Don, just diving into brutal historical fact. I'm leading this one, and it is just going to be a dense steamroll through about 25 to 30 years of history. We're going to cover all sorts of things like the general context of the book, some things about Gleijeses' methodology on how he constructs his history, how he tells the story, because he is an excellent storyteller, if nothing else. We're going to talk about the history of authoritarian dictatorships leading up to roughly 1945 to 1954, with the rise of Juan Jose Arevalo up to Arbenz himself, and all sorts of other good context, and all sorts of other good details, interesting little twists and turns in the historical narrative that we're going to try to explore in Gleijeses' book. Part 2 is going to be coming at you next week, and again, I would highly recommend people listen to this maybe once, maybe even twice, just because of the density of the material, and hopefully because it's a good episode. And hopefully that's why you keep coming back every week, because we do good episodes. You like our work. Alright, we're going to dive right in, but let's run down our general housekeeping that we do week to week. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, along with our podrads at The Regrettable Century and From 78. Remember, we have our own network podcast feed where we do roundtable discussions, and hopefully going to be putting up some writing and like a reading list and all sorts of cool stuff. If you aren't already a patron of the show and would like to become one, go down in the show links and you'll find a link to our Patreon page, and for as little as $1 per month, which is roughly a quarter per episode, you can get access to all of our exclusive content, which includes our Discord server and includes Red Library Cinema Nights on Tuesdays, as long as the quarantine is still on. And last but not least, all the exclusive episodes that we release roughly one a month of. Like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. If you're listening on iTunes, please go down and give us one of those star reviews. Maybe write us a line or two, as that is increasing the show's reach and our listener base. All right, y'all, let's do this thing. Without further ado, me and CC Don on Piero Gleijeses' Shattered Hope, the Guatemalan Revolution in the United States, 1944 to 1954. We'll see you back here at the tail end. Enjoy the ride. Well, hey there, comrades. Welcome to the history wing of the Red Library. I'm down here in the stacks and the catacombs with my my most inimicable podcasting partner.
What's up, Paul?
CC Don.
How's it going out there?
They can't answer you. We don't have the technological capability for them to answer you directly.
Isn't this the perfect situation?
That is true. How much do you think we try to operate on the parasocial relationship thing with like YouTube videos and podcasting?
I don't know if are we allowed to answer that ourselves? Do we? Maybe other people should answer that for us. Right?
That's right. Comment. Send us a message. Send us hate mail about how good we're doing on establishing a parasocial relationship with you.
So this is going to be our first Central and South America part of the series since COVID, right?
I was actually thinking that. Yeah, it's our first one since COVID-19. The apocalypse has happened. It's also our first one we've done since 2019, because the last one we did was our two-parter on Saul Landau's The Guerrilla Wars in Central America. So yeah. I was looking at the time. I think that those were our last episodes we did before our holiday break. So this has been a long time coming, not only for 2020 and waiting to get this episode on the books, but also I think I was mentioning to you too, this is it is hard for me to overstate how important this episode is. I think not only for the show, but for me personally. And the book that we're going to be covering, which is Shattered Hope, the Guatemalan Revolution in the United States from 1944 to 1954 by Professor Piero Gleijeses. I read actually almost a year ago on the nose, and I have just been waiting for us to finally do this. And So this is kind of a big deal, guys. It's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, and I'd also like to say this is just evidence, right? That I don't think we ever give up on any of our reading series, even if you don't hear about them for a long time.
That is true.
Still have other ones in the works.
That is a good point. Like, because sometimes it might feel like, oh, like we kind of lost track of that and we're doing a lot of psychoanalysis stuff. But I really like that we're doing this episode now because it comes right in the middle of our McGowan reading series. And I think before listeners hear this episode, there was the episodes we did on Baudrillard with Triple C from Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. Just to let y'all know, this is, we haven't lost our roots. You know, our very first episode was on Arab Spring, Libyan Winter by Vijay Prashad. And to me, this kind of book always reminds me of kind of like the first initial show that we did, which is just, you know, brutal historical fact and just sort of talking about conflicts and geopolitical sorts of developments in relationship to communist and leftist movements all over the world. So yeah, to me, this is kind of back to square one.
Exactly.
So I feel like you and I can't do this episode justice without also mentioning one of our initial influences for doing the show and kind of one of our biggest influences for how we do the show and why we pick the things that we do. So I feel like we need to give a big shout out to Radio War Nerd here.
Yeah. They literally just had an episode, Gleijeses, come out like a week ago. I mean, I guess, if this is... Probably once this comes out, it probably would have been about a month ago. But
time is both an illusion and a flat circle, so don't worry about it. So whenever it happened, it happened.
It happened recently, more recently for us than it will have happened for you. But
because we're from the future. So, but yeah, we want to give a big shout out over to Dolan and Ames at Radio Warner, just because they are a continuing influence on us. And I think the things that we're interested in, the types of topics that we like to cover, what we strive for. And also they just had Gleijeses on talking about the relationship between Cuba and Angola and U.S. foreign policy, which is a different Gleijeses book that he wrote. We wrote 2 books on that, one before this and then I think one after this. Again, Gleijeses is a phenomenal scholar. We're going to talk a little bit about him in a second. But for me, I just felt like because we're getting back to our roots, we also need to shout out the RWN gang and just let them know that, you know, they're a big influence on our work. And hopefully they might enjoy our episode, considering they just did something with Gleijeses as well.
Yeah.
Wow, just no bullshitting on this one, huh? I feel like there's like a gravitas to us doing this episode. I think
we went to get our customary alcohol before we started the episode, and I think both of us said no. We're gonna do this completely stone cold sober.
Yeah, stone cold sober, which is maybe gonna help or ruthlessly hinder us. We'll see how it goes.
It's probably gonna hinder me, but yeah.
Well, I think we also said since I'm gonna lead this one, I have 18 pages of notes.
Yeah. I think, I'm going to be taking a back seat for this one, just interjecting a little bit here and there. But, if you're one of our listeners that can't stand me, this is the episode for you.
And if you're one of our listeners who can't stand me,
you might want to download a different one.
Yeah, you might want to skip this episode or just bite your fucking tongue. But don't worry. I mean, I think it's going to be less about bullshitting and jokes, although there'll probably be some of that. But again, this to me is like it's a very important and serious episode to tackle. And so, we were both talking about doing our best, or how can we make sure that we do justice to the material, to the historical context, to the event or events, I should say, themselves. So, hopefully, this one might be a little bit more straight down the middle,
Yeah, that's what we're shooting for.
That's what we're shooting for. We'll see what happens. All right. I'm going to do my best not to make any Lacanian references throughout this whole episode. We'll see how that goes.
Put your bets now, people.
All right. Well, you
guys win.
So remember, whenever you were wanting the timestamp, the first time we say dialectical in each episode, we'll timestamp when the first Lacan references come out, if at all. CC Don, you got your PPEs, you ready to turn the factory machines on?
Let's get it started.
All right, here we go. Podcast making time. The last Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America episodes we did, for listeners who checked those out, they may remember that we mentioned how Landau actually had 3 distinct chapters on 3 distinct countries. So we had Nicaragua, El Salvador, and then we had Guatemala. And we said we weren't going to tackle the Guatemala ones because we were going to do another book later. Well, this is that book. And so maybe in some ways we're trying to close the loop on that initial 2-part series that we did, and kind of doing, coming back and finally getting to Guatemala, which is, to me, I guess, the more I've understood the history, and even listening to a recent Radio War Nerd episode on Indonesia, the way that the CIA sort of interventions and just ruthless backing of coups, and not only Iran against Mossadegh, but also in Guatemala with Arbenz, and then we're going to find out with, everything that happens in this particular historical context that, in some ways this is going to set the stage for a lot of Cold War politics, third worldist movements, revolutionary, and not even so much revolutionary, but even just like fairly like liberal, like democratic socialist reform movements around the world, and then basically how they're going to sort of succeed or rise and fall based on the sort of larger geopolitical situation of U.S. foreign policy and the struggle between the Soviet Union and the U.S., and how this idea of these two sort of kind of like monolithic superpowers, again, just kind of so thoroughly obscured all these fascinating radical developments all over the world that, still today, I think it's still hard to find the history of what actually happened in a lot of these contexts. And I know that for me, reading Gleijeses' book was sort of a revelation to kind of help me understand in a much more nuanced way exactly how these larger sort of contexts obscure a lot of the really interesting, very specific national and historical context of a place like Guatemala or a place like El Salvador or Nicaragua or whatnot. So for me, I think why we decided to do this book is I was looking for a very specific book about Guatemala and about Arbenz, and from what I gathered, Gleijeses has a reputation for being a revisionist historian about it. I was curious, whenever you hear that phrase revisionist historian, what are the connotations you usually take from that when you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to read this book by this particular historian?
Well, I think it depends on who's saying it, right? I think
good point.
A lot of times it's used as a sort of a condemnation that this person is like changing the narrative, or twisting the narrative, right? Especially by people on the maybe the right or the center will use it, as an insult that somebody is a revisionist historian. But I don't know. I feel like the entire purpose of writing history is, in a sense, like to be revisionist. Is it like if history has been written already and we know everything, there's no reason to, in a sense, continue to research it and just discover new things and to rewrite essentially our understanding and our narrative. So, of course, I know some people who would use it as an insult, but to me, I feel like if it's not revisionist in some ways, then is it really a scholarly historical work if it's not revisionist?
No, I think that's actually a really great way to frame it, because one of the reasons why I picked Gleijeses' book, of the few that I could find that are actually, in English or have, at least been translated, is that there seems to be, he has this reputation because he doesn't bow to the sort of like U.S. like State Department like foreign policy sort of perspective on what happened in Guatemala. He also doesn't really bow to this narrative that basically what happened to Guatemala could be completely reduced to basically the United Fruit Company basically dictating to the U.S. that they were going to intervene. So one of the things, and we can kind of get into a little bit of the context of the book. So Gleijeses, like his approach to this history was to basically, he's very good about really digging into archives and really having a broad perspective of the archives of the particular situation. So, I know in his interview on Radio War Nerd, he talked about, he looked at not only the archives of Cuba, about like their relationship to Angola and like sort of like participating in the conflict there, but also looking at like the U.S. State Department's archives. And so he tries to really, I think, bring a very objective and balanced approach. And I think that in some ways it actually, like, it makes his analysis so much more complex and nuanced, but I think like you don't lose any like radicality in it. Like in some ways, like his use of these archives and being so thorough and meticulous actually like supports like kind of a much more radical history, I think, that doesn't lose that kind of nuance. Yeah, because
this book is coming a little bit after the really well-known book, which is called Bitter Fruit, right?
Yeah, which is, I have another book by the guy who wrote Bitter Fruit on his book Overthrow, which is on my anti-imperialism reading list. Okay.
Some of this book, in a sense, critiques, right, that idea in Bitter Fruit of where, this idea of just basically being the brainchild of the United Fruit Company, and that Gleijeses and I think a couple others that come after him, seem to really call into question this and show that like they weren't nearly as big of a mover in the history that I think that book had made them out to be.
Yeah, and what we'll get into is how I think if you were to look at, let's say, like 1944 or 1945, the United Fruit Company, or what we're going to call like UFCO, like they did have a much bigger influence in Guatemala, but by the time the coup actually happens, their influence is far less than what it was. And in some ways, like sort of ideological interests of the U.S. State Department, and particularly the Dulles brothers and Eisenhower's sort of rise to the presidency, those are end up going to, I think, carry more weight for Gleijeses. Speaking of like kind of his approach and his methodology to how he's going to work through this history, one of the things I love about this book is that it's really, really grounded in interviews. He did a lot of first-person interviews and a lot of in-depth sort of discussion with people all over the spectrum of that actually were sort of involved in this sort of particular historical period. So there's interviews with a lot of people from the Guatemalan Communist Party, a lot of people from all over the different sort of range of positions in the Guatemalan political establishment. He also interviewed Arbenz's wife, who I think he was one of the first people, if not the first person, to interview her after the coup about what happened. But he also interviews U.S. State Department officials and, you know, other people who have some interest in the actual context of what happened in Guatemala with Arbenz. And it isn't sort of just restricted to one particular viewpoint. He does really, I think, strive to present a complex and nuanced picture of the history, which, again, I think leads to an actually like an even better book that doesn't really lose any radicality because of that. I guess a couple of other details about Gleijeses. So this book itself was published in 1991 by Princeton Press. So Gleijeses, I think, is currently a professor of U.S. foreign policy at Johns Hopkins, I think is where he currently is. Although I can't remember where he was exactly at the time he wrote the book. You know, we kind of mentioned how he's written this other book, and these other books, I should say, about Cuba's relationship to Angola and to decolonization across the African continent. So whenever he wrote that book, he was actually the first U.S.-based scholar to actually be given access to the archives in Cuba. So he has kind of this special distinction for, I think, revolutionary politics and revolutionary historical sorts of work, that he is one of the few people, or he was the first person who was actually given access to the archives in Cuba about specifically this period and the period of Cuba's involvement in decolonization across the African continent. So to me, I think it just kind of lends, you know, a lot of weight to his credentials about his sort of, I think, the validity of him being the person to read, and how he was like sort of like his actual relationships with people like Castro and the Communist Party in Cuba. And so one other thing that maybe some people know, because there is this really strong connection between the history of Guatemala and Cuba, is that one of the things that radicalized Che was his sort of viewing, and I think he might have been in Guatemala at the time, of the actual overthrow of Arbenz. And so to me, there's this really important connection between what happened in Guatemala to something like the Cuban Revolution, and then the U.S.'s sort of Bay of Pigs invasion and the intervention in Cuba. So to me, again, it's like part of this bigger historical map that I feel like, for me, I'm always trying to like learn more about and kind of fill in more and more by studying these different contexts. That's all I got for the context, man. You got anything you want to throw out, or any particular?
I'm eager to jump right into it, man.
Okay, I always like to ask you this before we do episodes like this. So what do you know? I see your skeptical look. So prior to us doing this episode, and maybe I know you read Landau's book, but like prior to us getting into this material, like what did you know, or what did you hear about Guatemala or Arbenz or any of this history?
Very little. Obviously, even preparing for this episode, I read some stuff here and there. I didn't read this book specifically, but, you know, I got an idea of it. But if it would have been before this podcast, in general, I would have known almost nothing. So I actually visited Guatemala when I was in high school. Yeah.
Why is it that you always drop these huge bombs in the middle of us doing a show? I didn't know that.
Yeah. I was there for
with the CIA
10 days. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You were there as a CIA station
when I was
chief?
16. Yeah, exactly. It was long enough ago that I remember very little about it. But no, I would think it made an impression on me. So obviously, when I was that age, I didn't have the faintest idea about anything.
Maybe for just further context as we go through this, that comrade listeners out there might also find really interesting. I think with particular historical periods or revolutions or anything that we're going to talk about, I think it's always good to sort of broaden out your your material that you're operating from, or like your references and your source material. So one of the things that I found really helpful is that there are some really fantastic documentaries about not necessarily like what happened with Arbenz, but the historical legacy of authoritarian dictatorships, of, genocide, like mass killings in Guatemala that, still continue, and the resonances are still alive to this day. So a really famous documentary that if anyone can find it, it is on Amazon, but I know it's also free on YouTube, and I'm going to post a link in the show notes, is a film called When Mountains Tremble. It is phenomenal. I'm going to post that. I highly recommend people watch that. And then there's a follow-up to that the same filmmaker made, I think in the late 90s, called Granito. And so that is also kind of built on the same like historical legacy of the fall of Arbenz and what happened afterward. So again, I highly recommend people check those out, and maybe you and I can watch those at some point, or maybe do a movie night on them, because I think they're really worth watching. And then I'm going to give one last resource before we dive in. Not too long before you and I did this episode, you forwarded me to a post on bad history on Reddit that was specifically about Arbenz and some of the weird like conservative reactionary interpretations of the history, which I found to be truly phenomenal. I'm going to link that in the show notes, but one of the things I really love about it is that most of the sources that were utilized by whoever it was that was responding in like a really thorough, just completely just facting and logicking, like whoever it was that posted that original story, Gleijeses' book was their primary source, or one of their primary sources, along with another book that is actually published by the University of Texas Press called The CIA in Guatemala, which I've also read. And we might kind of touch on that here and there. But anyway, those that post I think is phenomenal, and it would be a good overview of a lot of the history we're going to talk about with Gleijeses' book too.
Yeah, and just to be clear, bad history is a collection of anytime people see really bad history reported somewhere on the internet or on Reddit specifically, then a bunch of people get together and shit on it. So
yeah, and I can't recommend it enough. It's a great website. I now follow it with all notifications. But that post to me was a really, really phenomenal one. Let me actually say one more thing before we get into the context, because we got a lot to do. Why is it that this episode seems so important to me? And even though this episode is coming in our Revolutionary Politics in Central and South America series, I thought that, in many ways, this episode to me fits into our Lost Horizons network philosophy, or like our approach, which is finding these sorts of historical moments that either were defeated or were subverted, or somehow there was a promise, a historical promise, or a potential that existed that for whatever reason, either by its own design or by direct, defeat by other outside forces, that potential, that promise was vanquished in some way. And I think like the reason why Guatemala still, to me, carries this gravity and this importance is because reading through the history and understanding it more and more, I can't help but think about how huge of a lost horizon this is. Not only just for Guatemala itself, because I think that in itself is huge, but to think about the then like impact of the US's sort of confidence in smashing and like overthrowing other like even like soft democratic socialist regimes across the world, sort of its subversion of things like communism, or at least like some sort of like socialist reform in Indonesia, in Iran. I mean, just all these incredible places. And I feel like to me, this is like a generative starting point of a lot of what would then come to defeat those forces and create all these lost horizons historically. So for me, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's kind of, I was trying to think through why does this carry so much gravity? And I think that for me is like what I take from this is like what was lost by the overthrow of Arbenz and what that meant for the world political stage that, so many other revolutionary and even like, more reform oriented like socialist movements then had to contend with. I mean, thinking about Chile and Allende, which we're going to do who knows how many episodes on that in this series too. You have any thoughts on that?
No. I think you're absolutely right, though, to talk about this as like a lost future is absolutely, seems spot on.
How about we start diving into this and maybe with the introduction, we can talk a little bit about what exactly is this lost future, this sort of like lost horizon that, existed in Guatemala for a very, very short time. I thought it might be helpful to start with a quote. And this comes right out of the introduction from Gleijeses, and it's from an interview he did with Alfredo Guerra Borges, who was the leader of the Communist Party of Guatemala, or what we're going to call the PGT for the rest of the episode. Borges says, "It wasn't a great conspiracy, and it wasn't a child's game. We were just a group of young men looking for our destiny." And this is essentially what Borges describes as kind of what basically they understood themselves to be doing in the Guatemalans' situation with Arbenz, and kind of like what exactly their political mission was. To me, I thought that was a really interesting sort of way to start, because it sort of counteracts like what was the standard Cold War US sort of narrative about this for God knows how many decades, which has been like Arbenz was this ardent, rabid communist who was like completely at the mercy of the Communist Party of Guatemala. Like he just sort of was either a rampant communist himself, or was just basically a lackey or like a stooge for the Communist Party. And I think what Gleijeses' book really helped me understand is that it was actually a much more complex history than that, and it's a much more tragic history than that. I kind of like that quote for me kind of already like shows the sort of complexity and how this doesn't fit into any like simplified narrative of communism versus like capitalism, although that's absolutely going to be part of it. But it's just, it played out in a much more interesting and I think subtle way than at least the typical story, even from like people who are communists in the States or wherever, about what happened in Guatemala. What exactly happened in Guatemala? If we had to very quickly summarize, like what was the revolutionary, radical kind of horizon and potential of what happened? What I think really gives the Guatemalan Revolution its significance was it was the first true agrarian reform in all of Central America. So we've talked a little bit about this with places about the importance of land reform in places like Vietnam, and how like most of what was actually the main program for the Marxist-Leninist Party in Vietnam was essentially, it was all about agrarian reform. Well, in terms of Central and South America, the agrarian reform of Guatemala was the first, and also like, you know, again, like preceded a lot of other developments all over the world on the importance of agrarian reform for a radical revolutionary project. Like land and who controls the land, who has the land is, again, like in these particular contexts, in these particular nations, is like a very, very key point of struggle in revolutionary politics. In Guatemala, basically through the agrarian reforms that's going to mainly happen during Arbenz's like very, very short time in office, over 500,000 people, and that was basically like 1/6 of all of Guatemala's population, basically received land when for God knows how many generations they had none, or it was controlled by either corporations like the United Fruit Company or sort of landed gentry or whoever it was, or sort of like, you know, like wealthy like agricultural interests. The scale of that is just massive, like 1/6 of a population receiving like a vital, in some ways, like a mean of production that like they hadn't had for God knows how long.
I think that this is a really interesting point to, I think, just show how misunderstood or maybe misled a lot of, at least to me, the people that I know in the U.S. when they think about socialist or communist revolutions. Maybe we've talked about this on other episodes, but a lot of times when I talk to people and they like, their idea is that a socialist revolution would mean that they lose their, you know, like 3-bedroom family home or something like that, because, you know, private property doesn't exist anymore or something like that. When it actually, like, when you actually look at the history of these things, right, there's actually like an explosion of people that were able to own their own land, because it was when we're talking about private property, it was not the ability of people to, you know, live on their own small plot of land. It's the ability of a massive corporation to dominate a whole country or something like that. And so it's just like, you know, when you actually read about these things, it's that fear of, you know, people not getting their own space or their own space to live. It's like the history is exactly flipped. It's exactly inverted.
Absolutely right. I mean, in some ways, I'm wondering, do you think that what people are like more afraid of is, again, like this sort of weird, I mean, in itself, that is a capitalist kind of reactionary narrative, right? It's like, oh, these things were about like people coming for your toothbrush. Again, like totally obscuring like the historical, economic, political context of, you know, these situations where like inequality and like wealth disparity is just like astronomical. Like it's hard to even imagine how this is, you know, in these former like colonized nations like Guatemala and other places that, you know, the historical legacy of that has led to just, like massive impoverishment of like the vast majority of the population and consolidated like wealth and power in the hands of like, a few wealthy elites. And usually those wealthy elites are sort of beholden to larger foreign corporations, usually from the US and like Western Europe. So I mean, to me, that's like, again, one of those like tricks that like capitalist ideology is really subtly and not so subtly, I think, like teaches you to think that, oh, like that's what this is about. You know, it was like everyone basically just having to give up like these like basic means of survival. And it just fundamentally just obscures everything about the history. But again, it's pure ideology. Like that is the point, is to like obscure what actually happened historically. So in some ways, like you said, it's like the point is to be a revisionist historian, to go back and reanalyze and relook at like what really did happen. So I think that's a great point. Okay, so for Guatemala, I think a lot of attention gets put onto Jacobo Arbenz himself, but for Gleijeses' book and what we're going to do to try to do this justice is that we can't really think about Arbenz without understanding him in a much longer context that is, for Gleijeses, is going to span roughly 10 years. So even though we're going to talk a good bit about Arbenz, especially in part 2, I think we're going to also have to talk about another figure who was in power before Arbenz, and that is Juan Jose Arevalo. And Arevalo has such an influence and impact in Guatemala's history that prior to this, even like having some awareness of Arbenz and what happened in Guatemala, I didn't really know anything about Arevalo. And so we're going to have to talk about his influence and his role, because it's hard to understand Arbenz without understanding what Arevalo was doing as well. And in many ways, like they're kind of like two opposite figures. So Arevalo was a philosophy professor. He was, had his own brand of like spiritual socialist philosophy that was guiding his sort of reforms and like approach to Guatemalan politics and society. And he was this very like handsome, very eloquent, charismatic kind of intellectual. And that was part of what gave him sort of the support that he had. And Arbenz was sort of very different. He was like very introverted, very brilliant, but this like very subdued. He was a colonel in the Guatemalan military prior to his rise to power. And, he was very deeply passionate about social reform, but, again, in many ways, like more radical than Arevalo, but not quite as sort of charismatic and as much of like a sort of like charismatic leader, I would say. And so I think it presents a really interesting contrast to maybe some weaknesses that led to Arbenz's overthrow, and maybe some mistakes and like political decisions and strategy that, maybe would have been different otherwise. We kind of talked about this a second ago, but I think that, the context that we understand Guatemala through today, or at least in this sort of like post-Cold War narrative, is that what happened in Guatemala was essentially the, quote unquote infection, because they always use the language of disease and sickness whenever we talk about communism in the U.S. Cold War narrative, is that Guatemala was essentially infected by a communist outside Bolshevik influence of the Soviet Union. This is obviously going to be horribly wrong, although communism really did have a huge influence in what happened, especially during Arbenz's time and some of the social and agrarian reforms he attempted to implement. So whenever we think about kind of that narrative that Stephen Kinzer lays out in Bitter Fruit about how essentially like the overthrow of Arbenz was almost like directly implemented at the hand of the United Fruit Company. So I think this narrative basically is one that still sort of exists, right? And even Kinzer will like talk about it. But I think what Gleijeses is going to do, and he actually is like drawing on this perspective of where this comes out, is directly from him interviewing like the people who were the fucking communists in Guatemala, which you would think would have a vested interest in saying like, yes, it was like the evil capitalist corporation who was responsible for the overthrow of this really radical revolutionary movement in a lot of ways. That basically he has this quote from Fortuny, who is like, again, was a really active and like high up member in the PGT, but also one of Arbenz's closest friends. So Fortuny has this great quote where he says, "They would have overthrown us even if we had grown no bananas." And I really love that, because to me, it's kind of showing there's this way that like there's an overdetermination, that the ideological framework of the Cold War and as it was developing didn't necessarily need some sort of like outside guiding like corporate influence. Now, there was an overlap between people that we've already talked about a great deal, like the Dulles brothers, and how I think it was maybe Alan Dulles sat on the board of the United Fruit Company, I think earlier in his career, like in the 30s or 40s. So there is a strong connection between the U.S. State Department and United Fruit Company. But again, the idea is that at the time of Arbenz's overthrow in 1954, the ideological influence of anti-communism and the sort of like world conflict between capitalism and communism with the Soviet Union like almost didn't necessitate like a corporation being so kind of malevolently pushing it behind the scenes. It was almost like it was kind of going to do that anyway.
Matter, yeah. Like I said, I don't remember if it was this book or if it was a different work by another author. But I also have read that, these like cluster of like revisionist histories that kind of came out after Bitter Fruit. Also like looked at just the communication and correspondence within the State Department, and just found very little evidence that it was the United Fruit Company that was actually pushing for it, that it seemed like it was pretty independent of that. So
yeah, and I mean, I think that's just like further proof for Gleijeses's like actual conclusions in the book as well. And actually like, direct sort of statements and interviews with the people who were actually involved in all of this too.
Right.
I just to really quickly summarize Gleijeses's, we're going to call it his dabble assessment.
Yeah.
Basically from President Truman to President Eisenhower, that U.S. intelligence on Guatemala's situation actually became more subtle, and the influence of the PGT increased in Guatemala with Arbenz, while the United Fruit Company's influence on the U.S. decreased. So if we want to think about this as kind of almost like a scale, as we go from 1944 to 1954, from Arevalo's time up to Arbenz's time, United Fruit Company's influence on the U.S.'s sort of decisions around foreign policy decreased, while actually communism's influence on Arbenz through his sort of relationship with Fortuny and with other people in the PGT actually increased. So the idea would be that if, the United Fruit Company was really the one behind it, you would maybe see a different relationship between those influences on the U.S. State Department's policy and on actually what was happening in Guatemala. And I guess he kind of really summarizes this by saying that what we're trying to look at, or how we can maybe better understand this, is that it's a really complex interplay of sort of imperial habits, which I have to say I love the idea that imperialism is comprised of a set of habits. I just thought that was a really fantastic way to think about it. So imperial habits, security concerns around creeping influence of communism and how they thought that might happen in their own backyard of the U.S., and also economic interests as well, and we're going to talk about those a bit. And he basically says that Fortuny's assessment is actually borne out by history, that really the overthrow more than likely would have come without any sort of influence of the United Fruit Company and the sort of relationship to banana production and agricultural production in Guatemala as well. Well, that's roughly our introduction. I mean, CC Don, you have any thoughts or any other comments before we start on chapter 1 and get into some of the more long-form history of Guatemala leading up to Arbenz?
No, like I said, man, I think this is going to be a lengthy one, so I feel like just dive in head first.
Here we go. We're going to kind of lay out this history starting with another really key figure in Guatemalan history. And we're going to talk for a few brief moments about President Ubico. We're basically going to start around in late 1920s, early 1930s. There's a really interesting relationship, again, to larger revolutionary politics in the region and how this is going to create this context for an authoritarian like President Ubico to sort of basically gain power. So in 1932, there was a revolution in El Salvador, and basically there was roughly the slaughtering of 10 to 30,000 peasants that had an enormous impact on the Guatemalan Communist Party as it was just starting, and the Communist Party of El Salvador as well. The way it was understood at the time is that in El Salvador, that the Communist Party was seen as the sole organizer of this actually pretty spontaneous peasant revolt or uprising, or rebellion even, let's say. So President Ubico at the time basically states that, a Bolshevik uprising in Guatemala that essentially could gain control of the unions and peasantry have been crushed, but essentially it was a complete lie. So Ubico, basically in response to the Salvadoran Revolution, basically claims that there was a similar thing that was attempted in Guatemala, but luckily they crushed it, and that basically it sort of created this context of virulent anti-communism, basically having this sort of authoritarian legitimacy to be stamped out from Ubico that basically was just completely fabricated because of this situation in El Salvador, which even in El Salvador wasn't actually led by the communists. That also in itself was just complete ideological garbage, just to essentially justify anti-communism and fear of Russian Revolution and Bolshevism as well. So in terms of Guatemala's sort of economic kind of resources, because these are going to be really huge to understand how we get to the point of Arbenz. So historically, Guatemala actually had few resources compared to other Spanish colonies, and this was even after independence itself. So a lot of other places, which if anyone remembers in our first episode of this series talking about Open Veins of Latin America by Galeano, a lot of other countries might have had bananas, or Cuba had sugar, or Brazil might have tin or copper, or oil for Venezuela, which gave them sort of this key commodity which would then allow them to build up their economies. Guatemala actually didn't have those same resources as a lot of other countries did. And it wasn't until coffee becomes a major export crop in the late 19th century that they started to see foreign investment come in, and they also saw a particular development and investment in the railroad system in Guatemala. And this is really kind of the point which brings Guatemala onto the world stage and the world economic stage. It's sort of this rise of coffee as a major crop, and then also the investment of foreign capital into railroads and coffee production specifically.
Is there an explanation for why the investment in railroads?
I do know that there were a couple of key corporations that were involved. I don't remember Gleijeses talking so much why railroads themselves were specific, but I think it had to do with like Guatemala maybe being a key point of like transfer of goods across Central America. And so I imagine that was probably it, is that those corporations probably spanned across countries, and so it was about moving goods. Gotcha. And I do know that the United Fruit Company, which we're going to talk about, also had other plantations, like not only in Guatemala, but also in places I think like Honduras and like other places. And so, you're going to see that these corporations do span multiple national boundaries, and they really are truly international in that sense, I think. And I'm sure if there's a very astute listener who knows their Guatemalan history who has a better answer to that, I'm sure they will definitely let us know, which is why we love them so much.
Yeah, put that shit in the comments.
During the 1920s, during Ubico's reign, this is a period of, very limited democracy, but there is some increased freedom of press, some unionization. There are some strikes and wage increases. So even though Ubico, I think, is pretty clearly an authoritarian, like an old school kind of authoritarian, there are some sorts of reforms that do kind of lead to some basic increase in like democratic freedoms, let's say, and even in some ability for workers to organize. So in 1922, the Communist Party of Guatemala, or the PGT, is created. And it's really created by a lawyer and 12 artisans. And almost immediately, Ubico outlaws the party. And even though it was very, very small, like a handful of people, it actually developed a huge influence in the labor movement. And this was really due to this organizing skill and I think like the passion and dedication of a lot of the members themselves. So we're going to talk about this because the PGT, I think, is always going to be fairly small in comparison to a lot of other parties in Guatemala, but its impact is going to always, I think, it's going to punch above its weight, let's say. It's always going to have a lot of influence despite its size, and we're going to see how that plays out with Arbenz in particular. In 1929, Ubico basically comes to power, and I think I maybe said Ubico came to power in the 20s, but some of those reforms came prior to Ubico, I think. But once Ubico comes to power, this is going to be basically on the heels of the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression. And without maybe much surprise here, in the wake of an economic disaster and of, increasing social crisis and economic crisis, sometimes people turn to some sort of like strong populist kind of leader, some authoritarian leader to kind of respond to that. And essentially before that, he was a governor as well. And he had this reputation for just being horribly ruthless and efficient. And he also had strong U.S. backing right from the get-go. So immediately from 1929, as soon as he comes into power, like he is already deemed, someone worthy of the U.S.'s support and someone who aligns with U.S. interests. Ubico spends, I think, roughly 13 years in power. And during that time, he's slashing public expenditures, salaries, and really implemented great repression after what basically claimed was that communist plot, which I think happened in 1932 after the Salvadoran Revolution. So really, in some ways, he basically implements a brutal, repressive austerity program, which, is not a surprise considering how that is still a vital legacy, and I think politics all over the world, but definitely in Central and South America, with sort of the history of coups and overthrows of communist and more radical democratic socialist leaders and this sort of implementation of authoritarian regimes. So austerity is usually the economic program that comes into play after that. There is a really interesting shift here that under Ubico, there's a shift from obreros to empleados. So this is kind of an interesting shift to think about this in terms of worker rights and economics and politics, because essentially it's a shift from workers to employees. And you kind of notice that there's a interesting and fairly subtle, I think, shift into how we think about the relationship between labor and politics. If you no longer think of yourself as a worker, quote unquote, but as an employee, has a different connotation, I think, to sort of how you might think about yourself. And this seems to be a pretty conscious shift that Ubico was wanting to make to essentially ensure, to try to disempower labor organizing and some of the more radical revolutionary labor politicians and organizers that were present at the time. Let's talk demographics a little bit. What do you think? Everyone's favorite topic, demographics.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. We love demographics on this show. A really important division that's always been key in revolutionary politics is always, especially in contexts like Guatemala, is always the division between the city and the country. And this is going to be especially relevant for Guatemala's case. So basically around this time, 90% of Guatemalans lived in very small, usually agricultural rural communities. And on top of that, about 2/3 were indigenous peoples. So, and above them, in terms of the class sort of structure, there were Landinos, which usually could be definitely like mixed race or even like more Spanish or even indigenous, but basically like higher class position, usually had more power. And above them were the white landowning elites. So common thing, indigenous peoples lower on the totem pole, lowest on the totem pole, usually mixed race or some people with like some like Spanish descent, and then white landowning elites usually at the top. And from my understanding, like some of those white landowning elites were definitely Guatemalans, and then others were foreign nationals as well. So indigenous people in Guatemala were definitely like the primary labor force, and most of them lived in a kind of like debt peonage to their masters. So again, it's kind of this situation where even though like you're a worker, the relations between like workers and their bosses and landowners is almost like feudal in nature. So kind of this interesting way that like these feudal like labor relations are almost persisting in Guatemala, specifically for indigenous peoples who were the primary labor force. So Ubico legalized murder against indigenous peoples, and basically I found this like really just terrifying and kind of relevant to U.S. history with slavery as well. Like he basically shifted direct sort of harmful violence or discrimination against indigenous peoples and workers to he shifted it more to vagrancy laws to basically clean up Guatemala's image abroad, to sort of like put a shiny veneer over like his authoritarian, like violent repression. But he still was using the military as his primary tool for domestic control. And he had a lot of police support as well. And most of that police support was kind of coming mostly from like sort of more poor Landinos as well.
And can you remind me what the Landinos means?
So I think a common definition for a Landino is basically a person who lives in like Latin America, Central and South America, who speaks Spanish and is like quote unquote westernized. So it's almost like an ethnic cultural distinction of how someone is like a mixture of like European Spanish descent, but also of like indigenous Native American descent as well. I mean, another word you could use is a mestizo. Okay. So basically it's kind of someone who has like a sort of like mixed heritage. So again, it's kind of like maybe more of like an ethnic or, you know, in a lot of ways, like ethnicity is kind of classified as race, like in a lot of ways. But I think it's not so much a class position, although like, you know, race and ethnicity and class position tend to align in like very similar ways. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. That was a good thing to clarify. So in 1934, there actually was a conspiracy against Ubico in Guatemala that was crushed essentially by the military and the police. And, you know, around this time, we have the rise of fascism in Europe as well. So we're talking early to mid 30s. So fascism is rising in Italy and in Germany. And, you know, I think this is sort of increasing the kind of like authoritarian sort of practices and kind of fear of communism in places like Guatemala as well, because it's always important to remember that one of the first sort of like violent repressive functions of like a fascist sort of regime is to basically destroy the communists and any sort of like radical left-wing like political movements as well. A lot of like communist criminals and intellectuals were sort of like Ubico's main fears. He kind of like lumped them all together as one thing. Like, so if you're a communist, you're a criminal. And if you're an intellectual, you must be a communist and a criminal as well. And he was a great admirer of Franco and Mussolini. Big shocker on that one. So this is a quote that Gleijeses has from Ubico, just to sort of distill all of his political approach and fear of communist and criminal and intellectual influences into one statement. He says, "Communists should be given a dose of lead and not freedom of speech."
I mean, I feel like I've heard almost the exact same thing from right-wingers here in the U.S.
That is actually a really interesting thing to bring up. Funny how those statements tend to be so eerily similar across time and across historical and even cultural and national context. Yeah. Basically, Ubico bent to the U.S. will, and he even moved against German immigrant communities in Guatemala at the behest of the U.S. and even had them deported. And, you know, also not surprisingly, he was very sympathetic to U.S. corporate interests in the region too.
I don't want to take us on too much of a tangent, but what was that? Was this during the war, or why was the U.S. Interested in the immigrant community?
So I think the idea was that I think maybe once war was declared, or maybe near the end of Ubico's reign, if I can remember the timeline, I think the U.S. basically were sort of like had fear of like German immigrant communities basically serving as like spies or some sort of like being influenced by like the Third Reich or whatever that might like move against the U.S. or infiltrate the U.S. in some way, if I remember correctly.
Okay, gotcha.
Throughout this period, or up to the end of his reign, after I guess like the 13 years or so that he'd been in power, there's increasing uprisings and unrest about Ubico and about everything that's going on, repression, like military and police violence. And he basically steps down voluntarily and states that he realized that the vast majority of people didn't support him, but also because of health reasons. And so he steps down in 1944, right at the tail end of World War II. After Ubico steps down, he appoints a junta as his successor. And basically, who eventually comes out as like sort of the most dominant in that junta is Ponce. And he basically opens up free elections in Guatemala. So essentially, Ubico steps down, appoints a junta, and then that junta actually implements free elections to sort of, I think, counteract the kind of authoritarian history and legacy of Ubico. In that presidential election, or in those election campaigns, we start to see the rise of Juan Jose Arevalo, who basically at the time is a university professor. Again, he's this very handsome, very charismatic intellectual, and he sort of emerges as the leading presidential contender of the time. Now, there's also another coup that happens at this time against Ponce, and this was actually initiated by Arbenz himself with the help of Major Sandoval. And essentially, they were sort of like, this coup is initiated after increasing uprisings against Ponce's crackdown and utilizing Landinos and indigenous workers to engage in violent attacks in urban areas. So even though Ponce was implementing these free elections, he's still an authoritarian and still engaging in all these authoritarian, repressive sorts of maneuvers. And so even as far back as 1944 and 1945, got to give big ups to Arbenz just being an OG. Even back then, he was participating in coups and uprisings that were designed to overthrow these authoritarian leaders. After the uprisings and after Ubico steps down, he escapes. Shocker on this one. I feel like every time we do these episodes, it's always shocker on this one. Where does he go?
Sometimes there's just things that are so predictable.
So you want to share with the comrade listeners where Ubico escapes to?
He escapes to New Orleans and pesters the U.S. government for his property.
That's right. He was basically trying to get the U.S. to help him claim his, of course, rightly claimed property that he he gained as a authoritarian, brutal, repressive president of Guatemala for 13 years. So let's go ahead and move into the presidency of Arevalo after this point. So after Ponce, there's another three-man junta basically established after the coup. So this three-man junta is basically going to be a combination of Major Arana, Captain Arbenz, and then basically a civilian who is Jorge Torriello. For Torriello, he's basically, he's kind of an energetic conservative element in the government. So kind of very different than Arana and Arbenz. And basically, to the U.S. Embassy, I think they were very, very in favor of Torriello, basically having influence in the junta. So once this junta is in power, and a key sort of economic concern here is a lot of the latifundistas, who are basically the private wealthy landowners of plantations and things like that. They basically thought that spike in coffee prices would basically give them the power to buy off middle classes and urban workers while developing rural Guatemala. So it's kind of an interesting thing here that this sort of wealthy landed elite who has all these resources, because of this world spike in coffee prices, injects huge amounts of capital and investment in and sort of profit into Guatemala. And to some degree they were well, maybe if we have all these funds, we can buy off the people who are in lower class positions than us, and then maybe develop rural Guatemala to some extent, but still basically preserving the class structure and hierarchy and their power. But through this time, the military still remained the arbiter of the country's political life and essentially had a monopoly on all power and violence. And they were very loyal to the latifundistas as well. So let's talk a little bit about Arevalo and how he starts to come in to play in Guatemalan politics after the junta. Arevalo, we kind of mentioned, very much an intellectual, very much a philosopher. He basically earned a doctorate in Argentina in education. And under Ubico, he actually held a mid-level education post, but didn't really hold it for that long. And he basically left back to Argentina in 1936. And I think this was seen as a really kind of big strength of his, because even though he was involved with Ubico's regime, he actually was out of Guatemala for a lot of this time. And I think people thought that he had a certain purity or lack of corruption precisely because he was not actually in Guatemala during those years. Around 1944, basically there is a new institution formed that's called the Renovación Nacional that basically has Arevalo at the head. And again, I kind of mentioned he kind of starts to implement what he called his spiritual socialist philosophy. And what's really interesting about this, and this is sort of an interesting sort of ideological thing for revolutionary politics. So Arevalo comes in, starts to develop all this influence, very much built on this spiritual socialist philosophy. But what's interesting about it is that it really shifted the concern not from class relations in Guatemala, but to more sort of spiritual, soul of the nation, kind of ethnic, cultural sorts of concerns. And really, this is kind of part of why Arevalo was able to develop the sort of wide support that he did, because he removed the sort of struggle about class and class relations and against capitalism from his spiritual socialist philosophy. he didn't seem to be as much of a threat to the upper classes as someone like Arbenz eventually will be. And so he basically sees the main conflict in Guatemala as about an aristocratic class gaining control and having control, and not so much about conservatism, and really which was like basically he said this is more a question of aesthetics and not like material economic relations, which I found to be like a really, really fascinating thing. And in some ways, like kind of a relevant thing to consider now too, you know, about how much like a shifting of a radical philosophy towards questions of aesthetics, or, you know, again, like a certain class that is defined not by its class position, but by, you know, a sort of like decadent set of like social practices, in some ways like is much more amenable to like wealthy upper elites, because again it kind of removes like the thing that is most directly challenging their own position in the hierarchy. I'm curious, whenever you hear that phrase spiritual socialism, what comes to mind?
Skepticism, I guess.
Yeah, it's an interesting phrase.
Yeah, that's about all I can say.
There's really not much else to say about it. Yeah, actually, I do really want to read some of his stuff on spiritual socialism at some point. I'm actually very curious to actually read some of the writings. In May 1945, the election's held and Arevalo wins, basically with 85% of the vote of literate men, who were the only enfranchised group at the time. So Arevalo comes into office, huge sweeping landslide victory. So the general conditions of Guatemala when Arevalo comes into office. So 70% illiteracy rate in Guatemala. 2% of landowners own 72% of all agricultural farmable land. And I think we actually saw a similar sort of statistic in Vietnam as well whenever we did our episode way back in the catalog with Comrade Jordan as well. Impoverished indigenous Indians like basically were prevented from social and physical betterment for fear of asking for wages and basically and more land. So it's kind of this interesting like sort of condition where, you know, they might have the general like social like space to improve their conditions, but the sort of larger like repressive conditions, like the way that land was distributed, like who owns that land, and like fear of retaliation and like and basically like ruthlessly like crushing like any kind of like labor organizing, there was like a really intense fear about what would happen if you did ask for like wage increases and more land. And so that was part of what created this kind of stasis in the sort of like labor relations, especially among agricultural workers. And we kind of mentioned this, but maybe the biggest advantage that Arevalo had right as he came into office was this huge spike in coffee prices. And I think that came like right at the tail end of Ubico as well. And so for Ubico, he basically was able to pay off Guatemala's debt with those rising coffee prices. And so in a way that frees up Arevalo to sort of have, you know, resources and space for like some of the reforms and programs he's interested in without feeling like he has to carry around all that debt that they had accumulated throughout that time. A couple of other things just along with what we talked about with sort of his approach in spiritual socialism being more an aesthetic question and not a material one. So basically some of his reforms under this large sort of like program of spiritual socialism, so it increased enfranchisement, but with limitations for non-literate women. It did develop a multi-party system within Guatemala for the first time. There is an increase in trade unionism, but it really is limited to only cities and really excludes, again, like 80-something, 90% of the population, because most of Guatemala's population lives in the countryside at this point. The Communist Party was still basically outlawed and proscribed, and some of the Communist Party members were actually deported by Arevalo as well. So again, so much for the spiritual socialism and at least the socialism part of the name. And it was basically seen as a sort of alternative path to not just Marxism, but also conservatism and liberalism.
Everybody's got to have something, right?
Everybody's got to have something. I wonder where J-Reg would put spiritual socialism in his tiered hierarchy, you know? So basically there's kind of a main contradiction in Arevalo's spiritual socialist philosophy, and it's essentially reforms, but only reforms that exclude rural and indigenous populations and really kind of favored people with middle-class backgrounds and this sort of new party elite that's arising. So basically Arevalo and all of Arevalo's friends and people who like come from the same sort of class and like urban kind of environments that he does. I really love this. That Gleijeses basically describes Arevalo as a populist leader instead of a political theorist, which I found to be really interesting because even though he was given this reputation for being this intellectual and like had this like spiritual socialist philosophy, Gleijeses still sees him as mainly a populist leader, which I thought, you know, kind of might go a long way to explaining the limitations in his political theory. So a little bit more context. Let's talk a little bit about revolutionary parties around this time, because these are going to be huge whenever Arbenz comes into power. So around this time, there are going to be three primary revolutionary parties. There's going to be the Frente Popular Libertado, which is the FPL, There's going to be the Renovación Nacional, which is the RN. That's the one that basically like was started by Arevalo and like was supporting him. And then there's the Partido Acción Revolucionaria, or PAR. And this is going to be the most left wing of the three parties. So we have the FPL, the RN, and then the PAR, and the PAR is the most left of the revolutionary parties at the time. We have these three revolutionary parties, and we also have two very combative labor organizations. And those are going to be the Federación Sindical de Guatemala, or the FSG, the Confederación de Trabajadores de Guatemala, or the CTG. This is going to be the most communist influence of the two. Again, we have three revolutionary parties and two labor confederations, we'll call them. So the FSG and then the CTG, which is the more radical communist influenced. And essentially these revolutionary parties and labor confederations are going to be mainly putting consistent pressure on the government. And they also help provide a lot of the active votes and support to the revolutionary parties. So the relationship between the revolutionary parties and the labor confederations was a pretty tight one. And there was a lot of influence and sway from the revolutionary parties. Basically, the labor confederations were like a main driver of their support and membership. In the countryside, we kind of mentioned how Arevalo like really excluded a lot of the countryside in his reforms. So in the countryside, there was some improvements. Vagrancy laws and forced labor are no longer enforced. Basically, indigenous people are started to be granted citizenship for the first time. There is some increase in education access, and for the first time, mayors could be elected. But distribution of land was not addressed in any way, and Gleijeses describes it as kind of this cancer still rotting throughout the entire country. So even though there was some moderate reforms by Arevalo, the heart of the issue, which is agrarian reform, was still not even touched by Arevalo's spiritual socialist reforms. In response to this, or maybe as an alternative to this, Arevalo basically attempts to begin a sort of like colonization project and untilled land in Paptun to basically increase production. So I think the idea is that there's this deadlock, this contradiction in Guatemalan society, and it's like, well, we can deal with this a handful of ways. We can either redistribute the land, and then have to deal with like the radical changes that will bring about, or we can basically sort of like look to colonization, or basically developing another sort of area, maybe even colonizing it, which will then allow us to increase production and sort of kind of make up for whatever the sort of inefficiencies of this huge and unequal land distribution were at the time. So the thing with this colonization strategy from Arevalo, though, is that it was massively expensive, and it already clashed with Guatemala's already strained budget and like lack of human resources for the sort of scale of the project of like developing entirely this whole new region that had been untilled and unfarmed. And literacy efforts, although they were like important, without larger social reforms, they didn't really improve the situation of the indigenous people in Guatemala and a lot of the laborers and people in the countryside either. Unionization efforts in the countryside are resisted, and there was even a way that like Arevalo would withhold equipment from them, along with imposing legal restrictions on unions. So again, the sort of crackdown and restrictions on unions in the main place of labor's sort of work and production was like still brutally and pretty ruthlessly, I think, sort of squashed or like prevented by Arevalo. So a lot of the indigenous laborers at this time are basically forced to sell their labor due to a lack of sufficient land for themselves, which basically further consolidated and sealed landowner power and the lack of unions' ability to protect agricultural workers. So it's kind of this vicious cycle where you don't have enough land to actually like produce anything for yourself. You're forced to basically sell your labor on the market to other landowners. And then also at that time, like because like you don't have a consolidated labor force, because everyone's selling their labor in the sort of like hyper free market way, the ability to actually be protected by whatever union organization that was there, like you basically lose out on that. And I guess kind of the last thing here is that essentially Arevalo's middle-class background, I think for Gleijeses also played a significant part in like why he didn't see agrarian reform being this like major contradiction and sort of like key area that had to be addressed. Is almost like growing up in this sort of like middle-class like intellectual environment in the city, it's like you wouldn't necessarily understand the importance and relevance of that for the larger Guatemalan society as a whole. And I think, it's maybe no surprise that Arevalo's efforts like looked pretty inadequate to the actual like agricultural worker and like peasant needs, but they looked revolutionary as fuck the latifundistas and a lot of the wealthy landed elite. So it's kind of this interesting place Arevalo puts himself in, where it isn't actually going nearly far enough to address the people who really need the reforms, but for the people who are the wealthy elite in Guatemalan society, it definitely looks severely challenging and revolutionary to them.
Again, I feel like just like a theme that we see pretty constantly, right? Which is, doesn't matter how middle of the road that a reformer tries to do. It's like the landowners and the far right wing are just going to label them as being too radical and revolutionary anyway, and they're just going to resist all the same. So
I mean, it does pose an interesting question historically. I think we're going to see this in Chile too, right? Is like, if you can already pretty much count with a lot of historical precedent that any reforms you're going to implement in any kind of way are going to be brandished as like over level 9,000 revolutionary reforms, despite how like limited and like fairly tame they are. Mm-hmm. Why not just go full on?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're going to get the same amount of resistance either way. You might as well like do something that actually makes real change. Well,
and I think what we're going to see with Arbenz is definitely going to take that route instead, and we're going to kind of understand like what happened with his approach as well. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit during Arevalo's sort of time in all of this, a little bit of how U.S. sort of foreign policy and U.S. interests were kind of observing what was happening in Guatemala. There was a U.S. military attaché at the time who basically his interpretation of this was that conservative elements in Guatemala attributed all labor unrest to communism, and they basically said it was easier to do business and make money during Ubico's time and Ponce's dictatorships than it was at the time of Arevalo. So this to me is a really, really crucial point, and it cannot be overstated. A lot of times the reason why like wealthy capitalist elites and like, people who do have like they benefit from the systems or this sort of like political and like social economic situation is that it's good for business. Mm-hmm. Like this is the thing that I think I took away from so many Radio War Nerd episodes, from thinking about the episodes we did with Comrade Jason as well about like Egypt and stuff, is that having a dictator in power just makes it a lot more simple to do business. It's a lot more profitable.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence or an accident that the U.S. ends up supporting a lot of dictators. It's for a very, I don't want to say good reason, but for a very clear reason.
Yeah. I know that you and I are going to do some specific episodes on the role of the church in Central and South America, specifically during this whole time period. So we're going to introduce just a little bit here because the church is going to be a major player in the sort of conservative reaction, not just to Arevalo, but also very much with Arbenz. Mm-hmm. The church in Guatemala at this time, their model of political democracy and social justice was Franco's Spain. Oof. So big oof on that one. Big yikes for me, dog.
Yeah, bad luck.
Yeah, definitely not good optics for the church, basing it on Franco's Spain. So basically, no surprise here, they strongly resisted anything that Arevalo wanted to do in terms of reforms. Now, we mentioned a second ago that prior to Arevalo's winning of the presidential election, there's this junta that is formed that basically is Toledo, Arbenz, and then I think he was he a major or colonel? But Arana. So we're going to talk a little bit about Arana because he is going to be really important with the relationship between Arbenz and with Arevalo. So again, it's kind of this like very tight-knit like cast of characters that are happening historically on the stage at this point.
And so just to be clear, Arevalo was president, but there's still the junta that was above him at this time?
So I think the junta has actually been dissolved, but the people who are involved in that junta still carry a lot of influence and political power because, and it's actually a good segue too, so thanks for that pro podcaster move, because Arana and Arbenz are actually the most two influential military officers when Arevalo takes office. And so they still carry a lot of weight because the military still carries a lot of weight in Guatemalan society. Or let's just talk a little bit about Arbenz for a second. So Arbenz, at the time of the 1944 uprising, which him and Arana actually like organized together. So Arbenz was actually a professor at the Escuela Politécnica, which is basically the sort of like polytechnic school at the time. And Arana actually led basically the honor guards in 1944 and actually had a lot more sway with the actual troops than Arbenz did. So again, Arbenz is kind of this like quiet, like more intellectual military officer, and Arana is actually like much more embedded in the troops themselves and has like kind of like much more of a stronger sway with the troops because of his basically leading the honor guards in 1944. And very quickly, Arana becomes incredibly influential, and he is the most powerful man in Guatemala's army. And basically, Arana did not want Arevalo to become president and actually encouraged Arbenz and Torriello to postpone the election. So you kind of see that there's like this power dynamic that's playing out in the junta prior to the election. So we're kind of like backtracking a little bit with that. So I think that the way that Gleijeses describes this is that Arana basically was like essentially like his ambition as the most powerful man in Guatemala's military, as being this incredibly influential figure, that basically essentially like he might actually be able to step into the role of the presidency or might be able to be be like the sole leader whenever the dust settles in all of this. And so there was a lot of fear that he was actually going to engage in his own military coup to basically overthrow Arevalo in 1945. But from what Gleijeses says, that basically he makes a deal that basically he would postpone engaging in a military coup if basically one of the Revolutionary Party leaders, if they would basically support him for presidency in 1950 whenever the next election rolls around. So basically, he's very ambitious, kind of sees that this might be an opportunity for him and agrees to postpone the coup essentially to guarantee support for an election down the road. But there's increasing tensions and strains between Arana and the PAR, as well as the other revolutionary parties and unions. And basically these tensions and strains over Arana's ambition and sort of his desire to maybe just overthrow Arevalo in a coup basically leads the revolutionary parties and unions to approach Arbenz to run against Arana in the 1950 election. And basically this is kind of partially influenced because Arbenz and Arana are actually starting to clash a lot publicly in terms of non-military affairs. So they're very, very conciliatory and very much on the same team if it's about the military. But whenever it's about larger political and social issues in Guatemala, again, they're both very influential, very visible public figures. They kind of are very clearly not in alignment. And so the revolutionary parties and unions see Arbenz maybe as someone who could run and beat Arana in the election coming up. So what's really interesting, though, shift of events in history, is that in July of 1949, before the year of the election, Arana is mysteriously killed at Puente de la Gloria, which is sort of a kind of a small bridge that was basically on the way to him, apparently to go meet Arevalo. And what's interesting is historically, there's a lot of speculation about who killed Arana and why. The killers were never apprehended, but I think at the time it was seen as that Arana was actually on his way to basically begin this military coup that he just kept sort of pushing for. And the elite saw Arana as their hope to seize power. So they basically saw Arana would actually support a lot of the wealthy elites. And so they saw Arana as that was their man. And they knew that Arbenz would not plot against Arana because he didn't want to disrupt the sort of military relationships and sort of divide I think the military at the time. But I think what Gleijeses kind of says is that there's this way of seeing that Arana's own overconfidence and elements of a quote unquote inner conflict against waging a straightforward coup basically led to this much more torturous path of basically he still wanted to be president, had a lot of reservations about a direct coup, but basically still was kind of trying to win over power, was always struggling against how he was going to do that. Was it going to be politically legitimate or at the head of a coup? But what's interesting here is that Arevalo is pretty savvy. So he saw the coup coming, and one of the things that disrupted it is I think Arana had this idea that Arevalo would just probably give up power, but basically Arevalo was a little bit more savvy and he wasn't going to capitulate as easily as Arana thought, which sort of disrupted the whole process. So this is Gleijeses on page 63, just talking a little bit about the details here. He says that Arevalo had no intention of giving up so easily. While the details vary according to the informants, the main lines of what took place within the government are clear. After Arana left, Arevalo summoned Arbenz and other key aides and informed them of the ultimatum, which is basically give up power, or I'm going to overthrow you in a coup. They readily agreed that Arana must be sent into exile. The next day, while Arana dallied at Barrios Peñas estate, which I think was sort of a wealthy landed elite, the permanent committee of the Guatemalan Congress met in secret session and voted unanimously that Arana must be dismissed. At the request of his friend Arevalo, Cuban President Carlos Prios Socaras agreed to give Arana asylum in his country, and then Colonel Consensa would fly the disgraced plotter to Havana. So kind of while Arana is thinking he's going to engage in this coup, Arevalo basically calls the secret session and basically gets the whole government to support actually expelling Arana from the country. It is on his way, I think, to essentially procure weapons that they were going to use to stage the coup that Arana is killed. Now, why this is so interesting or why it's so relevant is that there is, I think, a lot of indications from Gleijeses' point of view that Arevalo actually gave the order, or there's some speculation that he gave the order to Arbenz to have Arana killed. And so basically, the idea was that there was some speculation that Arbenz directly killed Arana himself without any other direction besides his own desire for the presidency. Mm-hmm. But basically, I think Gleijeses says the more likely story is that either Arevalo gave the order to Arbenz, or whoever Arevalo gave the order to, that it's almost he wanted it to be interpreted as if Arbenz was the one who was behind it, to basically almost weaken Arbenz's position as well, because Arevalo knew that Arbenz also carried a lot of weight and a lot of influence in the country and in the military. After Arana is killed, the honor guard rise in revolt for roughly about 24 hours after his death. And that basically Arevalo makes a public statement and tells the public that Arana's assassins were connected to circles seeking to overthrow Arevalo, but killed Arana when they realized he would not become a golpista, which is basically like he wasn't going to basically stage a coup. And years later, there's some speculation on why Arevalo spun the facts that way when it was not necessary that he really did it. And basically the idea is that it was designed to shift suspicions onto Arbenz and sort of weaken Arbenz politically. Let's now talk a little bit about the rise to power of Jacobo Arbenz. At this time, Arbenz enjoyed support by the PAR and the labor unions, but also by a handful of rich landowners and industrialists from the same city as Arbenz after the July 1944 uprising that he basically staged with Arana. So, Arbenz himself also has like a pretty interesting and sort of like varied base of political support. And I think for a lot of the more landowners and industrialists who supported him, they basically thought Arbenz would pursue very moderate social reforms. They basically saw some of the political and economic reforms for the lower classes as beneficial to their own class interests. So this is not a shock. Basically, the idea was basically pay off the middle and lower classes with some very kind of like piecemeal economic and social reforms, creates more stability, like reinforces the class sort of hierarchy in society, minimizes disruptions with paying people off a little bit. So essentially, Arevalo didn't back Arbenz for president because even at this point, he already considered him too leftist. So despite Arbenz being white and marrying an upper-class Salvadoran, so her name was Maria Villanova. So she was also kind of a Salvadoran elite intellectual as well. Guatemala's elites backed another candidate, Fuentes, to run against him as basically a more sure bet that they would represent their interests. So there was already a lot of questions of whether Arbenz was too leftist, was too connected to intellectuals, and sort of was a little bit less sure of a bet that he would support their interests. So Fortuny and others split from the PAR, which is one of those revolutionary parties we mentioned, and they actually attempted to create their own Marxist-Leninist-based communist party in defiance of Arevalo in the summer of 1950. And there's also this ongoing relationship between the Salvadoran Communist Party, and they basically exerted a really big influence on the Guatemalan Communist Party after essentially them fleeing from El Salvador. So there's this kind of like connection and influence between the two going all the way, kind of connections going all the way back to that 1932 sort of way that Guatemala and El Salvador and like the development of communism is sort of this like kind of, here's the timestamp, this dialectically informing each other process, which makes no sense. I just wanted to say dialectical. All right, so we're going to briefly mention another character that's going to be incredibly important in Arbenz's story as we go forward. So during Arbenz's campaign for president, there is a colonel. His name is Castillo Armas, and he was already plotting and discussing a military coup with Fuentes if Fuentes lost the election to Arbenz. So Armas is basically already in 1950 for Arbenz's election is already basically plotting with his opponent and basically saying, yeah, you lose this election, cool, I'll help back you in a coup. So this is going to come to play out very significantly before too long. So Armas actually is kind of this really interesting character because he's sort of this like, he's kind of like this fail son, I always imagine him. He's like this really like, like shitty, adventurous colonel who is like really kind of running rampant all over Central and South America and like sort of engaging in failed uprisings and coups. And so in July, there's an attempted uprising, it fails, and he flees to Colombia. And basically there's a question of like, well, how did he even get out of prison? Because he was arrested, and basically they think he probably bribed prison officials. But Arbenz essentially wins the election overwhelmingly in 1950. So Arbenz comes to power, 1950.
So, was there three people in this, like in the running? It was Arbenz, Fuentes, and Arevalo, or?
So I think Arevalo actually did not run at this time. From what I remember, he was not running. So, and I think at the time in Guatemala, like basically a president was limited to one term. So I think that was also part of the issue. And that'll come into play with Arbenz too, because whenever 1954 rolls around at the end of Arbenz's 4 years, he wasn't eligible to be elected president again. And that's going to pose some really unique problems for the revolutionary and communist parties at the time. I see. So where are we at? Chapter 5?
Chapter 5.
All right. So Chapter 5, which is really going to focus on more in depth on the U.S. and Arevalo and sort of the relationship between the two during that period from like 1945 to 1950.
And a little step back then.
Yeah, a little step back. That's one of the things I like about Gleijeses's book is that it's like it'll go forward and then it'll sort of retrack and then like relook at things from another angle before it moves forward. Okay. So the U.S. reaction to Guatemala really has to be understood in terms of the past civility of Guatemalan regimes to the U.S. and ongoing support of other banana republics with two kind of key issues at stake. So basically the idea of that the U.S. companies are being like persecuted by these sort of like more radical, like revolutionary reforms. I see the smirk on your face. Notice I have persecution in air quotes right there. And also by, I guess from the U.S., what they saw as like an irresponsible attitude toward communism. Again, this idea that like these places like Guatemala are allowing communism to quote unquote infect, you know, the nation and the political developments of the time. Again, we've talked about this a little bit of how, you know, again, the sort of like stupidity of like the U.S. and like not actually understanding what was really going on. And like seeing everything through this like very simplified, like good versus evil framework. So basically this is sort of like all like in spite of the fact that most of Guatemala's leaders were actually like virulently anti-communist. And I guess what they really saw was like a lack of sufficient zeal in Guatemalan leadership's response to the USSR. And they basically saw the USSR, you know, obviously like as an encroaching imperial power on other people like Somoza or like Trujillo. And so basically, you know, as we've seen before, they interpret a strong sense of nationalism in a country like Guatemala and a sort of lack of like virulent sort of response to the USSR as basically a sign that someone was like falling to communism or was being infected by the communist influence, whatever that might be. The U.S. financial investment in Guatemala in 1944 was mainly in the support of three main companies, and it was roughly to the tune of $93 million at the time. So this is the Empresa Eléctrica, the United Fruit Company, which we've discussed about, but then also that third one, which we mentioned earlier, which was the International Railways of Central America. So the World Bank and the UN both concluded in the early 1950s that Puerto Barrios is under complete control of United Fruit and International Railways and controls all import and export cargo through the Atlantic area. Just the idea that the amount of control that these two of these three main corporations operating in Guatemala at the time, you know, again, up into the early 50s, was basically just controlling all import and exports in the country and then throughout the whole region as well. And United Fruit Company, I think this was in the press at the time, was called the Octopus. And it was formed in 1899, basically whenever the empire of Minor Keith was merged with the Boston Fruit Company. So there's a quote. This is a little bit more on the impact or sort of the general sort of functioning or structure of the United Fruit Company at the time. So Gleijeses says the heart of its empire was in Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica, where it owned well over 1 million acres of banana plantations, but it also had plantations in Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Jamaica, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. The Great White Fleet, which was 85 ships owned by the United Fruit Company, carried UFCO's bananas to North America and Europe, making the company the largest carrier of the fruit. The ships also carried a significant percentage of the foreign trade of many of the smaller republics in which the UFCO operated, as well as some passenger traffic. The fleet was, quote, more than a source of income. It was a symbol of the company's dominions, at home, in the tropics, and on the seven seas, unquote. Still another tentacle had been added to the UFCO in 1913 when the Tropical Radio Telegraph Company was incorporated to ensure communications between the field and UFCO's Boston headquarters. By 1945, it controlled an important part of the international radio and cable traffic of Central America. The last major component of this well-integrated empire was the railroad. UFCO itself owned 1,400 miles of rail, mostly within its plantations. It also owned 42.6% of the IRCA, that's the railroad company, whose 794 miles of railroad constituted, quote, the most extensive rail network between Mexico and Panama, unquote. So to me, that paragraph I thought was really just devastating, and it's like very efficient description of like the actual like global spanning reach and the sort of dominance of the region of the UFCO, not just in fruit production, but also in telecommunications, in the railroad itself. So let's bring up two of our old characters, our old pals on the show.
Friends of the show, especially the Central and South American Revolutionary Politics series.
That is completely sarcastic. They are both evil demons. Number one, Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, and John Foster Dulles. Both of these men who are really key figures in not only the United Fruit Company history, but also in the entire development of like Cold War politics in the U.S. and also consumer culture and everything else, and marketing and advertising. Basically, they both had connections to UFCO and both lobbied for their interests very strongly within the U.S. State Department. Bernays was hired for public relations by UFCO, and John Foster Dulles was one of their senior associates when the contract with Ubico was negotiated in 1936. So again, these two key key figures have these strong connections to UBICO, to UFCO, and then would basically serve to progress and sort of support their interests in the United States government up to this period. United Fruit Company was Guatemala's largest landowner and employer. There is some truth that the UFCO helped develop Guatemala's resources and paid millions in taxes, because some people basically say, it's the idea of like, oh, UFCO actually did this like really beneficial thing. They helped develop Guatemala's economy. They did all this stuff. They paid in millions of taxes. I see you're doing the jerk off sign. I am also doing that. We're doing that together. It's synchronized. So there is some truth to that, right? Mm-hmm. But what that obscures in the context is that the UFCO also found many ways to undervalue land, skirt around taxes with tax breaks, and greatly lowered how much they actually paid in comparison to the huge privileges they benefited from. So essentially, in the grand scheme of things, maybe they did a little bit, but the amount at which they basically, ruthlessly just extracted from Guatemala in terms of like land and wealth and power, just astronomically disproportionate. So after the fall of UBICO, Guatemala state allowed UFCO to continue operating as a private fiefdom, essentially, and really never interfered on behalf of its workers, and they always portrayed strikes going back to 1920s as a result of Bolshevism. So the idea is that anything that would be like a spontaneous worker uprising, or anything that would basically challenge UFCO's like just sort of dominion over the labor force, was always like basically protected and seen as like, oh, that must be the communists, that must be Bolshevism, that's sort of underlying that. Arevalo does start to begin to try to protect UFCO workers, but again, this is largely not due to any sort of like socialist or communist sort of like struggle against capital, but is mainly about protecting like Guatemala's national interests from an outside foreign influence. So in 1947, a labor code is passed by Arevalo, and it basically aims to protect agricultural, commercial, and industrial workers. So UFCO basically saw it as discriminatory against itself. Again, it's being persecuted for its interests and it doing the good work that it does. And they basically turned to the U.S. State Department for help and stated that it was communistic influences emanating from outside Guatemala on Arevalo that brought about the labor code's provisions. So this is kind of in that period where, prior to Arbenz, like UFCO really did, I think, exercise a lot more influence over the U.S. government and the State Department. And again, it's this idea of like, oh, it couldn't be that just like Guatemalan workers just hate the like brutal, repressive, exploitative things we're doing. It must be the Soviet Union and Bolshevism from outside. At the time of Arevalo, the U.S. really viewed the entire region with some suspicion of being potentially like a beachhead for communism from the USSR, but they really didn't have any specific concerns. And so there might have been this like background hazy suspicion, but it isn't like they were like acting and like plotting coups and overthrows to arrest what they saw as like a sort of like increasing communist influence in the region. So UFCO's backlash against the labor code did sort of initiate U.S. suspicions, which tracked with leadership like Fortuny and Gutierrez's influence on Arbenz, pushing him left. So there is a way that you do start to see that because Arbenz is going to become more sort of strongly tied and like more influenced by some of the more revolutionary parties and communist influences, that this is going to sort of begin to set the stage for when they see this is actually a more specific threat that needs to be intervened in more directly. But there are some U officials, and this is one of the things I love about Gleijeses' work. Again, it's like pretty nuanced. He basically found in the archives and doing interviews that some U.S. officials actually saw moderate social reforms as actually being like pretty valuable, but of course, mainly as a defense against communism, and not unlike some of those like landed elites who basically thought, oh, if like we allow someone to get into office who will do some basic social reforms, it'll actually stabilize society and prevent a communist influence increasing. But by the mid-1940s, the Truman administration was beginning to see Guatemala as nightmarish, and I love this, as a nightmarish world infested by communists and all sorts of leftists and radicals. Gutierrez goes communist, but branded many center and even people on the right as well as moderate leftists as hard communists. So they begin to see sort of like everyone across the political spectrum in Guatemala as like they must be communists. And essentially, they're starting to interpret anti-U.S. rhetoric from nationalists across the political spectrum as inherently being communist and sort of their approach. And again, there is a grain of truth in this, like to some degree, like there was a really broad, like sort of nationalist kind of uprising against outside foreign influence. And it is important to say that like, yeah, the communist like revolutionary parties did actually start to begin to exercise more influence on the government, particularly because of Arbenz's relationship with people like Fortuny and the other radical parties, and his own, I think, sort of interest in sort of learning of like Marxism and communist sort of politics.
Does this book ever get into like whether there actually were ties to, I mean, my assumption is there were actually very few ties to the USSR at all in these communist groups, but is that discussed at all? Yeah,
actually, we're going to talk about that in a later chapter. There's one specifically about these relationships. I think Gleijeses's like conclusion is that the ties that were there were absolutely minimal. And in many ways, the USSR, like, you know, in the larger global political stage, they, I think, were more concerned about upsetting the U.S. and like causing tensions with the U.S. or increasing tensions, and didn't really care a whole lot about what was going on in Central and South America. You know, we'll talk about this whenever we do some episodes on Cuba as well, but and I think Gleijeses talks about this, that in many ways, like, Cuba was the sort of leader of like world communist revolution way more than the USSR was. And I think that, you know, China might have been better for a certain period, but in many ways they were like much more committed to that mission than China or the USSR. But yeah, it's a great thing to bring up, and we'll kind of talk in detail about what those relationships actually look like. So during this period of like 1945 to 1950, so ties between the UFCO and the U.S. State Department are strengthened. And there was really only one instance where the State Department official, like a State Department official, actually challenged the image of Guatemala as this like communist hotbed that like Truman was starting to buy into, that John Foster Dulles was pushing this narrative, that Bernays was pushing this narrative. So again, it's not like there is like a much more clear alignment between UFCO and the U.S. State Department. Let me say this too, and this is a whole other topic in itself, but very briefly, I just wanted to mention that there was some speculation that Arevalo was actually like behind or a part of what this sort of almost like quasi-mythical entity at the time called the Caribbean League. And the idea was that this was like a set of like communist internationalists who were fomenting revolution all across Central and South America in a really clear, strategic, coherent way. Like, so what was this thing? Did it actually exist? Well, it never officially existed, but there were a sort of like nuclei of exiled leaders from these various countries, and they could mobilize some loyal support throughout the region. But I think Gleijeses is basically saying like it was never actually any like formal thing that really was like operating this sort of like conspiratorial way. And a lot of them were really just exiles against the dictatorships that came to power in El Salvador and the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and they basically, some of them sought refuge in Guatemala from those dictatorships. But the reality is like actually a lot more complicated than what the CIA and the State Department thought. So basically, again, like within, I think, Guatemala itself, like there was a lot of, I think, tension about whether these sort of exiles should be granted asylum in Guatemala, like how we should think about them, and sort of how they related to other sort of like communist movements or dictatorships in the region. So again, the actual relationships were much more complicated than the CIA or the State Department like ever really were thinking about at all. And I think there was also some idea that if like push came to shove, that whatever the Caribbean League was, whatever it did exist as, that basically they would side against Soviet imperialism, quote unquote, in the region with the US if it came down to it. So again, it's kind of this way of like they want this idea of like there was some push to say like we want more independence, we want less influence from the US, but if it came down to the USSR and the US, like the idea was like, oh well, they'll probably back the US. So just a couple final things for part one on the US relationship in response to Arevalo. So the US view of Guatemala and Arevalo was that he was kind of like that. Basically, they were like very self-righteous about their own like mission on the world stage as like, you know, the sort of arbiter of freedom in the world. And they were really blind to actually Arevalo's like support of the US in many ways. So Arevalo actually spoke out against Ubico's dictatorship, but also like upheld the relationship between the US and Ubico as like being exemplary. I mean, one of the complications here though is that like Arevalo basically kind of did earn like the contempt and scorn from the Truman administration because he basically strongly contradicted this like US anti-communist hysteria that if you're a communist, you must be a, you know, in some ways what Ubico thought too, you must be like a criminal and an intellectual. And he basically saw communists, even though he like didn't support communism and like actually like basically exiled some of them and like repressed them, he did still see them as decent and honorable people and maybe even potential allies. And a lot of the reporting at the time, which Gleijeses talks a lot about, but we're only going to like touch on briefly, a lot of the actual foreign reporting on the country and the region was completely confused and very bizarre and just really could not accept the fact that maybe in Guatemala, their idea of democracy in terms of like labor and like literacy and like enfranchisement, you know, at the time, because the U.S. is still segregated, it's still Jim Crow, like everything else is before civil rights. The idea is that they could not accept the fact that maybe Guatemala had a much more radical view of democracy than the U.S. did. And so it led to this really confused, bizarre way of trying to understand what was happening in the region.
I'm glad that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good that we've progressed so far past that point in journalism and how we understand other regions compared to the U.S. for sure. Like just a dry, just pessimistic sarcasm today. That's all we got for you in this episode. The U.S. assessed Arbenz as an unsavory character, but still, at least at first, saw them as one that they could work with. After Arana died, basically due to interpreting him as not having very strong political beliefs. And they basically did not understand that if you were a military officer or a colonel, that you could be left-wing at the time. Again, this has changed now, but at the time, the idea was if you're part of the military, you must be inherently like conservative or reactionary, or at least like against communism or more radical revolutionary reforms. That will come back to bite them in the ass quite heavily.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, just from trying to think through examples I can think of, I mean, it does seem like it's a little bit more uncommon, definitely, doesn't? I mean, I'm trying to think of other examples of leftist leaders that would have come out of the military.
Hugo Chavez is probably the big one. Yeah.
Okay,
so I think in Central and South America, it's definitely like a bit more common. But I will say the early instantiations of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq were also like kind of coming out of like a more radical, like revolutionary sort of perspective.
Okay.
I hate to say this, but it's important to recognize that like Muammar Gaddafi like also like came out of something that you could qualify as maybe a little bit more like radical, not so much like socialist or communist, right? Because they saw like Islam as kind of like this other path out of, a sort of standard like dichotomy of like political positions. But, I think to some degree, it's like there is a connection between, I think, more radical revolutionary reform type approaches and also being involved in the military, because usually you're highly trained, you're an intellectual, you've been given access to college and education, probably have seen the world quite a bit. Actually, another one that I just remembered too that needs to be recognized on the show is Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. He was a military officer, goes to France.
Example,
studies Marx, studies Lenin, with a bunch of like communist intellectuals at the time, goes back, stages a coup, and as far as I'm concerned, like basically operates for 3 to 4 years as potentially one of the most radical revolutionary examples of like a state operating on like that kind of political program that I've ever seen, period. So again, I think it's less common, but it's common enough.
It's definitely not unheard of.
Yeah, it's definitely not unheard of. But I think at this time, there was no idea that like if you were a military officer, you could also be like a radical or a revolutionary. So around this time, the U.S. begins to punish Guatemala economically by essentially kind of influencing them to have like financial support denied by the World Bank. They're denied loans. And even under like Truman's 4 Points program, they basically are like completely sort of denied any kind of financial support under Truman's program, although they technically should have been qualified for it. And while there was no clear evidence that the U.S. influenced Arana's potential overthrow of Arevalo, like clearly they probably would have welcomed it and it would have been much more in line with their interests. And just to bring him back up, because I can't help but drag him on the show, in 1950, Edward Bernays basically pushes UFCO public relations to begin a campaign against perceived communist threat in Guatemala. The relationship between Bernays and his sort of taking over public relations of UFCO, specifically to push this narrative that Guatemala was falling to communist influence, was something that was done with the interest of UFCO in mind.
I'm curious, do you remember any of the details about that? Like, what did that look like from, like, what did UFCO do to try to like push this out into the ether, I guess?
I mean, if you think back to like what their sort of empire looked like, because I think it was an empire, like they also have access to like telecommunications and radio. Right, and I think they were influencing like publications about how things in Guatemala were being interpreted with Arevalo and Arbenz. If there were worker like uprisings or strikes, like to basically always interpret those as like the influence of communism and Bolshevism. Yeah. So I think a lot of it had to do with just how they spun the narrative of like what was actually kind of like spontaneously happening against their fucking brutal, repressive labor conditions and like exploitation of workers.
Yeah, and so would these public relations have been specifically aimed at like Americans?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, and we're going to see that. I think eventually like the use of propaganda and sort of like trying to soften like support of Arbenz in the military specifically is going to come about from the U.S. State Department and the CIA as a specific tactic. Gotcha. But I think at this time it was very much directed against the U.S. public and how they were understanding the region. Yeah, and like how it was being covered in the news for sure. All right, and maybe just to kind of wrap up on part one, like Gleijeses sees that the Cold War paranoia and the ignorance as bigger influences in the U.S. like relationship to Guatemala and the eventual decision to back the coup of Armas against Arbenz. By the time it happens, as actually a much bigger factor than the UFCO and Bernays' kind of like public relations push to kind of influence everyone and sort of like that they were kind of like the octopus that was controlling all the arms. So again, I think Gleijeses is saying that like by the time Eisenhower comes into power and everything else, or like from 1954 on, that at that point, the sort of momentum of Cold War hysteria and anti-communism like didn't need necessarily like UFCO to like pull the trigger for them. It's like they would have done it themselves, because the momentum for anti-communism and Cold War politics was just so intense at that time. So last kind of point here, Truman basically gave Guatemala a pass at the time, but essentially because they provided and demonstrated positive support of the U.S. against Soviet influence as a quote-unquote beachhead for communism in the region. What we're going to pick up with in part 2 is how, basically to summarize this, that at the time with Truman and Arevalo, they're definitely seeing there's the potential for this communist influence. But the main difference is that Arevalo is demonstrating enough fealty to the U.S., or at least kind of speaking out against the USSR enough that it was kind of like, well, there might be some issues there. It might be this hotbed of communist influence, but essentially we haven't lost control yet, or the communists haven't gained power. And so there's no need to sort of escalate what needs to be done. But what we're going to see in part 2 is that for Arbenz, because of Arbenz's influence and the people around him and his interaction with these revolutionary parties and his political philosophy, as an increasing Marxist throughout his life, especially in these last 4 years, that's going to drastically shift the calculus with then Eisenhower coming into power, and how that's going to shift kind of the political balance, I think. All right. I'm exhausted after part 1. That's a lot. This is a huge, complicated history that we're going over. CC Don, do you have any thoughts or any last reflections before we wrap on part 1?
Not really. I just gotta say, man, I'm feel like they're doing my best boys dirty by comparing a octopus to a global international organization.
Yeah, I much prefer Taibbi's example of it's actually more like a global spanning vampiric squid than an octopus.
Yeah, I mean, even I don't know.
Is that still too close for you?
Yeah, I still feel like I want to stay on some cephalopods. So
okay. Well, I mean, if you want to be a cephalopod stand, go for it.
Yeah.
Do you think what's an alternative? What's a cephalopod? Is it a phylum? Is it a genus? Anyway, what's another part of the animal kingdom tree that you'd be more accepting of?
I'll go non-animal. I'll go maybe mushroom.
I'm a bit of a mushroom stand, though.
Oof, no.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Well, I mean, okay, we'll debate this off air.
We're gonna be locked in Mortal Kombat here in a few minutes.
Mortal Kombat. Just that mycelium and a fucking squid just sitting there writhing on the ground. That's our Mortal Kombat. All right. Well, I guess we'll see you back here for part 2, and we're going to pick up on Arbenz and the Agrarian reform and the tragic end to the lost future.
Do you think we're going to need a part 3 for this one?
No. No, we're gonna get through it in part 2. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's confidence. I like that.
Yeah. I mean, well, this is on me. I mean, I'm leading this one, so if we don't get through it, that's kind of totally my fault, Well,
yeah.
So
I'm not going to disagree with that.
Yeah, I've just thrown down the gauntlet on myself. So, all right, comrades, I guess, we'll see you back here for part 2 of Shattered Hope by Piero Gleijeses.
Take care, man.
All right, peace out. Woo! I am exhausted. That was a lot of material, and that was not even half of the notes that I took for this episode, but I wanted to really do this one justice. Whenever we do these revolutionary politics in Central and South America episodes, the historical events, the context, the players involved, the shifts, the twists and turns of historical contingency and chance are just so thorough, it always feels hard to do any particular situation justice with just one episode. So my hope is that even if this is just a big 2-part episode, we can at least start to scratch the surface to represent the history, the legacy, the lost future well. And hopefully you can take some historical lessons from this and part 2 coming at you next week. We're just going to go ahead and get right out of here, let y'all enjoy the rest of the week to ponder, to think, to critically reflect on the situation in Guatemala as far as we've gotten through it up to this point. But remember, as always, keep fighting, keep dreaming, keep thinking, keep reflecting, keep analyzing, keep searching for those lost futures, because that is exactly what we're trying to do on episodes just like this one. And remember, we out here, comrades. We out here. We haven't gone anywhere, and that doesn't look to be changing anytime soon. You're stuck with us. You're stuck with our zany antics, but on episodes like today, you're also stuck with us whenever we decide to, stop being polite, stop trying to bullshit, and start getting real. That was like a weird amended tagline from the show Real World. That's a weird thing that just came streaming out of the unconscious. Anyway, we'll see you back here next time. Take care of yourselves out there. Stay safe. Wear those masks. Phase 2 of coronavirus is starting to kick in, so take care of yourselves. We're trying to do the same. We'll see you back here next time. Red Library out. Peace.